Another aspect that highlights the spiritual vitality of the 13th century is the rise of the Mendicant Orders. Mendicant comes from the Latin word mendicare, which means to beg. So these are orders that are committed to lives of poverty. The two most prominent mendicant movements are the Franciscans, named after St. Francis of Assisi, officially called the Order of Friars Minor, and the Dominicans, named after St. Dominic, also known officially as the Order of Preachers. These two orders represent an institutionalization or a formalizing of what was actually a very diverse movement in the late 12th and early 13th century. These movements were drawn to what are called the apostolic life and the evangelical life. Here, this is referring to ways of living found in the New Testament. So apostolic, living like the early Christian community in Acts of the Apostles, chapter 2. Holding everything in common, living together, committed to a common life of preaching, worship, mutual aid, and working for others. Or an evangelical movement modeled on the ways in which Jesus calls his disciples to live as followers of him. Having but one tunic, not taking money, going out preaching the gospel wherever it will be received. That is the evangelical life, and that is the apostolic life. What's new is people wanting to live out and formalize that kind of living in medieval Europe, and wanting to work this into existing patterns of monastic spirituality. And so emphasizing this way of being ordered into a formal religious life over previous patterns of the monastic life that we've seen, something like Benedictine spirituality or the desert spirituality traditions that emphasize a contemplative life, a life focused primarily on solitude and prayer. This is a significant shift of spirituality in the central period of the Middle Ages, and speaks to new spiritual concerns people have. And scholars have focused this concern with the development of cities and the rise of what's called a profit economy. Now, a profit economy is simply what it sounds like. An economy focused not simply on the trade of goods for sustenance, but a trade of goods designed to increase the wealth of some over others. What's significant here is that by the end of the 12th century, there is a stable monetary exchange system. For a significant period of time in the early Middle Ages, the use of coins had reduced. Coins were not seen as having shared and stable value across political zones. So from one kingdom to the next, people couldn't agree on how much a coin was valued. There's a new rise in stable currency, hard currency, and a new rise on engaging in things like banking and merchant exchange, which focused on making profit, lending at interest, etc. What this does is create a whole new sectors of the economy that don't seem to be based on producing anything real. The previous form of economy was a gift economy, where one exchanged items and services as part of an expression of a deeper networked relationship between sectors of a society. Now, the profit economy, that relational exchange is absent, and one is simply, instead of exchanging relationship, is exchanging coinage or an abstraction of relationship. And so there is a growing sense of alienation that also occurs. People feel guilty about the money they make off of others and wonder what to do about it. Francis of Assisi is one of those kinds of people. He is the son of a cloth merchant. He is deeply anxious about his wealth and about the ways he improperly spends his wealth and about the immoral activities he engages in because of all of the resources around him. So his conversion is a conversion of devotion to the human person of Jesus Christ, which also is a new element in spirituality. We saw this when we looked at the various examples of crucifixes in a previous session, and the ways in which the suffering Christ speaks to the suffering of individuals. And that heightened draw that we see in both someone like Ansel of Canterbury's satisfaction theory and Peter Abelard's exemplar theory. This creates a deeply incarnational theology for Francis, which leads him to focus on the work of reconciling people to one another in the same way that Christ reconciled the world to God. This creates the significant markers of Franciscan spirituality, an emphasis on poverty, humility, and love. Poverty here is the most significant aspect of Francis's theology, and we could see this as part of his response to the crisis of the profit economy, and part of how he expresses his devotion to the passion of Christ, the suffering, wounded Christ. That when we see Christ on the cross, we see the Christ who has emptied himself, as Paul's hymn to Christ in Philippians chapter 2 says. So poverty here is a renunciation of personal prerogative. In Christ's case, it was God the Son renouncing all of his glory so that he might dwell among us and suffer on behalf of us. So renouncing a prerogative leads to renouncing the privileges of the world. And so Francis models that in himself. He gives up his own prerogative and hence leaves the comforts and cares and concerns of the world behind. And so this is an embrace of poverty that's not as much initially here as a concern for the actual poor, but more about renouncing privilege and status in order to convert oneself more deeply to following Jesus Christ. And in some ways, we can see this as a very privileged view. Only someone who's rich might enter into this mind space. And it's certainly worth acknowledging that physical material poverty, as truly impoverished people experience it, is in itself not a virtue. And that kind of privation is not something that's part of God's desire for creation. We see this spirituality, though, playing out in Francis in the fresco that the Italian artist Giotto painted of Francis receiving the Stigmata. That is the wounds of Christ and his hands, feet, and side that Francis came to so powerfully identify with the suffering Christ, and in a way he became another Christ himself. That is, he took on the marks of the work that Christ calls us all into. Francis was a deeply charismatic figure, and he draws a whole gathering to him that of followers that are called fratres, or brothers, that we rendered in English as friars. In the year 1210, Pope Innocent III, the same pope who calls the Fourth Lateran Council, approves the Order of Friars Minor, this Franciscan order, as a way of institutionalizing the movement. And really as a way of capturing all of this energy around apostolic and evangelical spirituality. As part of being received, the friars received the tonsure, that is the shaving of the head, as a sign of being clergy, and swore obedience to the Pope. Most of the early members of the Franciscan movement were of nobility. They were knights or the patrician class, which is the kind of ruling class of a city, or burghers, which is part of the key mercantile aspects of a city's economy. So initially, this is not drawing from the poorest of the poor. It's really drawing from an upper class that is asking, how do we live now in light of the crisis of the profit economy? Alongside Francis, we can't forget the work of Clare of Assisi, who was Francis's longtime companion and is equally inspired to pursue this life of poverty. In the year 1212, Clare is clothed as a nun by Francis, and she and he work on forming the orders of the Sisters of St. Francis. They follow a rule of life given by Francis, and later follow an amended form of the rule of Benedict. In 1247, Innocent IV commissions a modified rule of life that's based on this Benedictine order. Clare resists this. She really wants a rule of life that emphasizes strict poverty, which is generally what was not found in Benedictine-based rules for orders of women. Female monastic orders in this time period could often be sort of like finishing schools for noble young women, and so not as focused on a real development of monastic virtue and practices. In 1253, Innocent IV relents and approves Clare's stricter poverty-based rule 2 days before her death. For Clare, her vision of poverty isn't quite the same as Francis's, where it's kind of a stripling of all privilege, but really being denied most material comforts in order to focus the attention on contemplation, especially focusing attention on a spousal union or a mystical marriage between a nun and Jesus Christ himself. It's a stripping away of all privilege in order to gain the pearl of great price. So there's different strands that exist in Franciscan spirituality, and really in medieval spirituality as a whole. It's a complex, exciting, diverse world. We see that even more when we pay attention to lay people who want to follow the mendicant lifestyle, whether they're inspired by Franciscans or Dominicans, but can't because they can't give up their jobs, or they're married, they have families. There is, these folks are called tertiaries, or members of third orders. These are lay, what we call confraternities. That is, lay associations, fellowships that are designed to bring urban groups, urban populations in to find a way to participate in mendicant spirituality. So find ways to pattern their lives while working in the world. And so they take up patterns of prayers from older forms of monasticism and adapt them to the lay experience. So for instance, daily recitations of prayers like the Our Father, the Lord's Prayer, and the Hail Mary. The development of the Rosary as a contemplative, meditative tool that lay people could easily access. The development of things called books of hours, which were series of prayer offices that one could say throughout the day that were short and could fit into an active life. So what today people in liturgical traditions would identify as daily offices adapted from monastic services, like a morning prayer, evening prayer service. Similar things were available for lay folk, and they could offer these prayers in either Latin or in their own local vernacular language. So this again shows that there is a really vibrant lay spirituality in the Middle Ages. And so again, this notion from Protestant polemic and propaganda of the 16th century and later that the Reformation had to happen because the Catholic Church wasn't paying attention to the spiritual needs of people is simply wrong. We just don't have good evidence for this. And the rise of tertiaries helps illustrate that. This focus then on how do lay people live in the world also helps develop a new set of practices around charity. There's an increased focus on charitable giving by lay people, which is stimulated by this crisis of the profit economy and the rise of mendicant movements. And so we see really good examples of this in wills that exist from the 13th century onward, where nobility give bequests for the poor, funds to make sure that a hospital is built, or that there's set distributions of funds to care for the poor, etc. Charity did a couple of things. It helped the needy by creating new foundations that serviced them, whether it was within churches, fraternities, or these fellowships that often had a charitable dimension to them, or this is the period of the development of the first hospitals. There also is a notion that this good work aided the soul of the benefactor, that this helped them as they were seeking out their own redemption. And the idea was that the recipients of charity would pray for the soul of the benefactor. So embedded in all this also is a developing doctrine of purgatory. Now, the doctrine of purgatory is something I'm going to explain in much more detail in the next course as we move towards the 16th century and its reformations. I'm happy to talk about it a little bit in class as well. So acts of charity, these works of mercy, also help create this medieval notion of a unified Christendom, that there is a common set of practices that all Christians could attend to and work for to ensure part of the kingdom of God will come about in their own time and place.